I'd like to thank very much the university for having me here, and specifically I'd like to thank Dr. Burrell and the other keynote speakers for their introductions, because one of those topics was the interdisciplinarity necessary for cybersecurity. And I remember hearing about the need for economics, the need for sociology, the need for human behavior and psychology. And these are particularly important topics to think about as we think about cybersecurity. They go to understanding why privacy is part of the conversation, and they go to answering the question that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is, why is it that after 15, 20 some odd years of paying attention to cybersecurity, and 30, 40, 50, maybe 60 years of computer science research in what we call computer security or network security or various topics related to security within those scientific fields. To be blunt, we still suck at cybersecurity. You saw on one of the opening slides in Dr. Burrell's talk that there are many breaches still going on. One of the visualizations showed the size of the breaches. Another one of the visualizations showed the different companies and over time and how many records. And we all know that this is a problem. Why is it that we can't do it? Well, the answer cannot be that hackers just are better at science than we are. I refuse to believe, and as it turns out, it's not true, that hackers are better than MIT and Carnegie Mellon and Berkeley and all the other computer scientists who are working on these types of issues. So that's not the reason that's going on. And the answer can't also be that we are not developing these technologies. We are. And the answer can't be that the problem is impossible. So that's the case we should just all go home. Well, so where does that leave us? If these technologies do exist, if the science does exist, and if it is possible to do better than how we are doing right now, why is it that we are not doing better? And that's the question that I'm going to present a preliminary answer to you today. And I'm going to tell you ahead of time that the answer I'm going to give you is because the intervention point we need is the law. I do have slides for this talk. I'm going to use them as reference points. They will not follow through exactly with what I'm going to say. So I will point you to the slides as they become relevant and as there are points that we need to address. And you'll note that one of the things on this slide which I mentioned is, why does cybersecurity necessarily involve law? Well, you've heard a great deal from my colleagues, both named Susan, about how, as we talk about privacy issues related to the exercise of security, it's extremely important to consider, how does the law view these issues? And privacy is one very, very important way of looking at it. And there are other similar topics which we don't look at enough as we write policy, as we make rules around how we will conduct security. I'm very pleased to be talking at this audience because when I heard from Dr. Burrell's remarks in the beginning, is that it appears that the Israeli government and the Israeli research in this area is much further along, to be frank, than the rest of the world. When I give this talk in the United States, it's usually about an hour, and I spend about 40 minutes of that time trying to convince people that cybersecurity is more than just computer science. So I'm just going to say the phrase, cybersecurity is more than just computer science, and assume that most people in this room will generally accept that. It's very fun for me to be able to move on quickly. So why does it necessarily involve law? Well, my answer to this question, and I'm going to get to some of the background on this as we go through the talk, my answer to this question is, there is no other single point of leverage besides making rules which we can use to adjust the cybersecurity ecosystem in a way that allows us to be able to affect systemic change about how we think about cybersecurity. So we have this question, I told you before, there's a long history. We have this question of, well, what exactly is cybersecurity? And you see some definitions up here which variously talk about the etymology of the words, where they come from. But I bet if I were to ask every person on this room to fill out a card writing down in 5 words what cybersecurity is, I would get at least a few hundred different answers, probably many more. What does cybersecurity mean? Well, part of the problem is that it means something different to many different people. Sometimes it talks about protecting a network. Other times people talk about encryption. Other times people talk about, no, this is the set of laws about how we defend the military and the intelligence and the law enforcement networks. Some people say, no, it's about the private sector's behavior and how they have to protect consumer data. Which is the correct answer? Well, the correct answer is all of these things and many more. Cybersecurity cannot be defined by a single topical area. Let me repeat that. Cybersecurity cannot be defined by a single topical area. This is incredibly important. Cybersecurity is an exercise. It's about process. It's about ensuring that our systems which we build, we've heard in our keynotes and you can see from both my panelists' presentations, information flow is something which, whether or not we like it, whether or not it is something we desire more of, we desire less of, it is a fact. It is a reality of what is going to happen. And therefore, ensuring that what we expect of our information is actually what happens and the systems which cause that flow. That's very important. Cybersecurity is an exercise. It is a process in ensuring that what we expect to happen actually happens. Now, well, then let's just make a bunch of rules about how that will work. The problem is, I just told you, cybersecurity is not one specific subject matter area. So, well, we have, okay, so make rules for energy, make rules for the military, make rules for finance, make rules for healthcare. Might work. Assume for the moment that it does work. What's the problem? Well, finance and healthcare talk to each other. Energy and healthcare interact. The government interacts, the civilian government interacts with the military. Both interact with the industrial sector. See where this goes. There are not clear lines we can use to divide off subject matters and say make rules for them. And so what I'm going to tell you is that we need to think of this from the prospect of a general process. Asking the question, do your risk mitigation or risk management techniques, meaning for one given case, the tools you employ, do those match the tolerance you have for how much failure is allowed? There will be failure. There is no perfect security. Anyone who tells you we can do perfect security is either lying or uninformed. Now, why can I make such a bold statement? I don't know whether or not they're lying, but I can tell you why it's not a true statement that there's perfect security. Because it is mathematically provable that for the circumstances where there is perfect security, the degree of restraint, the degree of constraints, as we call them in computer science, required to achieve that perfect security are so high that they will never work in real-world society. I can give you perfect security of a building. It's actually very simple. I build a wall, a magical wall that is impenetrable, and I never let anyone in or out of the building. And then it's secure. Well, first of all, there's two problems. One, I told you it's a magic wall. It's impenetrable. That doesn't actually exist. And two, I told you no one can ever go in and out of the building. Well, if no one can ever go in and out, what's the point? So we then need to rethink how we are approaching the question of security. We need to rethink it, not to be about prevention, not to be about perfectly securing everything. But we need to think about how do we do this? How do we conduct our process of business, our process of security goals in a way that works in the real world? And this is when we need to start talking about our tolerances and our techniques. Okay. I am going to very quickly talk about one example of a failure, which I hope will convince you that we need to move to this model. Cybersecurity is a unique problem because it requires both depth expertise. You need experts who understand network security very deeply, but as I have just told you, you also need a great deal of breadth. And here is the example that I intend to use. It's the example of password complexity. And when I talk about passwords now, I talk about passwords for authentication purposes, not passwords which are used for encryption purposes. Those are a special case. Many of you may have seen this comic strip. It's a comic talking about the problem of remembering those passwords. Password complexity is the idea that if you have a more complex password, your security is better. And I'm going to tell you that that is a lie. And most of the people in the room now who have expertise in computer security just decided that I'm an idiot and someone should throw me off stage. Well, it's not entirely true that it's a complete lie. The problem is that what we're not looking at is the overall or the net security benefit. Complex passwords for authentication do, in certain cases, make it more difficult to execute certain types of attacks. At the same time, they open up many other types of attacks. They open up social engineering attacks. They open up attacks where people use some other method to remember their password, maybe using the password reset questions. Well, the problem with those questions is they have to be easy to remember. Where you were born, because that's never something hard to find. My identification here in my wallet. Oh, hey, I was born in Connecticut. There's not that many cities in Connecticut, and if you figure out the part of Connecticut from which I'm from, not difficult to do, you can figure out I was born, where I was born, because there's probably only one city I was born. People also list their hometown on Facebook. These are the types of problems, is that yes, complex passwords do help with a variety of things. However, they open up other attack vectors. And in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you to trust me that there is analysis that I and others have done which show that while there are some things protected against with complex passwords for logging in, the danger of the other attacks is far greater than the tiny additional benefit added by the complex passwords for system security. So what is the problem? Why don't we recognize it? Well, computer scientists know about this. There's a paper written in 1979 by Morris and Thompson that talks about that. And there's papers written as recently as 2007 saying, yeah, this is kind of a problem. We've been studying this for a long time. So why doesn't it happen? The answer is policy making and policy entrenchment. This particular policy about passwords has been around for a very long time. And new policy making requires convincing policymakers not just that something is better, but that there's a reason to get rid of that older thing to reduce security, because that's what it looks like doing. It looks like reducing security. There's a phrase in the United States, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, because some people would say that in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, IBM made the best computers. And then in the 1990s, nobody got fired for buying IBM, even though they did not make the best computing systems. Why is that? Because it was easy to remember. So why is it that we cannot move this? And I'm going to skip past these slides. There's a great deal of information here I can talk to you about on the break, later, whenever is good, where I go through the proofs of the things that I've told you. Well, we do not use flexible models of regulation which afford the opportunity to engage in this risk management that I'm telling you about. And again, I can show you the analysis of this, but I compared two types of regulation. I compared very strict, here are the set of rules regulation, with regulation that was flexible, that said you must develop a plan where your risk techniques to manage risk match your risk tolerance. different for a retailer than from a nuclear power plant, than from the military. That model of thinking, bringing in economics, psychology, sociology, organizational management, to develop risk management plans. This also allows us to account for privacy concerns. And so I will tell you that it showed that this flexible approach was 4 times more effective, and that's what these slides all tell you about, and I'm happy to go into it in more detail. So in conclusion, what have I told you today? I have given you an example, one example, complex passwords, which shows how this strict approach, you must have a complex password, misses several key points, and the net effect is actually to weaken security. There are many other examples. If I had more time, I would talk to you about them. Collectively, which tell you that we should use risk management approaches. And law and policy are the venue through which we must work to be able to focus change. Because we have spent now many, many years and been unable to systemically affect this change. We have laws which direct these specific practices. No one got fired for buying IBM, so they're not going to go against those laws. And we must change the way we think about this in policy to allow for a more broad, more diverse, more interdisciplinary approach to thinking about managing risk. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any more questions as time allows.